Okay. Well, let's see if this setup works a little better than previous ones. Paul's video today, and if you're watching this, Paul, it was really interesting, because it really aligned with a lot of what we were talking about in the Discord server, BOM, in the Marriage Crisis channel, this morning, I think, where I was responding to Roland that I thought something that was really missing, that to be stressed in the conversation wasn't, sorry, I should start with his. So he had mentioned, not doing things because of a cost-benefit analysis, that we're too utilitarian, and mostly focusing this on relationships and marriage, but also just like being a person in general. And he said, what happened to just, following, Jesus, and hearing his call? I think something close to that. No matter what the cost might be. And that was part of it too. And I pushed back a little bit. I think I take his point, but I said what was missing, I think, is commitment. Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to follow the call. You fall in love with someone. It's another thing to really commit to them. And I think the challenge of commitment is kind of everywhere, pervasive, and is a part of all of the crises in many ways. It's part of the marriage crisis. It's part of the, the dating crisis before that. It's also part of the crisis of, the religions are facing as, let's say, organizations, and also from the individual level. And then, of course, let's say, the big commitment, theological, to a religion, to God. And then that kind of led into an interesting discussion, because I said, I get a lot out of, Judaism, around, what it means to commit, the structure of covenant and covenantal commitments, that, someone is once a Jew, always a Jew. So, right, even if they become heretics or apostates or whatever you want to call it, they still remain within the family. And part of that is understanding that covenant, and it's both generally through the ancient Near East, and then how it's realized in the Bible, at least in Tanakh, but I think also maybe the New Testament. I'm not gonna make claims that I can't substantiate. The whole point of a covenant is to bring someone into your family who isn't biologically born into your family. When we become covenantally bound to God, that is either depicted as a marriage, as it is in the prophets, or it's depicted as He's our Father. And that's not, one could say it's because He created us, Genesis 2, or 4, right, with the line of descent.
In 1.5 miles, take the I-495
Sorry, needed to turn that off. So you have this idea of covenant, which is bound up with commitment, and formalizes it in some way. But there's also this other kind of side of commitment, which is commitment is something that has to last. It has to last quite a long time usually. And I was asking, I see Judaism has taken on this not just multi-generational project, but a project for centuries and millennia, and in acknowledging that that it has to not only have the aim to be intergenerational, but also create a sustainable community that lasts, to last that amount of time. And then Mark F. Pointed out that the Catholic Church also kind of has this long-term vision, and is trying to figure out how kind of in this, I think he used the term post-apostolic world, to calibrate to kind of what commitment means these days. And it's not that the Jewish world isn't struggling with this too. It is. I just see a lot of useful tools that we have to address it, even as we struggle with it. And there's other parts, right? I think part of this is, you know, about propositional versus participatory, and not cutting people off over, you know, if they hold the wrong ideas in their head. And if you're going to really last a long time, like that probably is a somewhat important feature to have. And that led to this whole other bunch of other stuff. I wanted to get back down to Paul's video. So Paul's video really, first it had me thinking about essences, and, you know, whether we shared the same view of essence. I wouldn't call something that's an arenic, you know, something that merges transjectively between the arena and the agent necessarily an essence, right? An essence is something that doesn't change contextually in its kind of classical form. But then you know, are we talking about like a Platonic form type thing? Are we talking about something more Aristotelian, which has kind of the four sides, and then you have things like function and telos involved in it? Or are we doing something much more modern philosophy around essences? And I do think that there'll be some differences, but not so many necessarily between like historical Judaism and Christianity, just because, you know, we both went through a long time grappling with the Greeks, even if we accept different amounts of them in different ways, or the Arabs or whatever. I mean, a lot of different metaphysical systems have kind of filtered through, and we've all kind of been grappling with that. However, after all that essence stuff, which I think we should come back to, I really like the part about sincerity. And I don't know if that would be the word I would have used. I might have used the word integrity, but that's probably just being influenced by Job and through the Jesh and Shari conversations, or in Hebrew, probably the word timimut. Tam is the word there when we talked about Job and his integrity. What does that mean, right? So he's sincere. It's not that there's something like, this isn't authenticity in the way that it was used in Paul's video earlier, but this is sincerity. Sincerity, as in the way it was defined by Miller in there, was basically commitment to a relationship with the arena, right? And I think that's perfect. I think that really helps clarify and connect all the dots, because I just argued the thing that's missing is not necessarily passion, but commitment, and people don't understand what commitment really means necessarily these days, and it's hard to model. And there's also kind of forces, not just that there's a lack of knowledge about commitment, because I think it's not that hard to understand in a sense, even if you don't see it modeled. But there's this much bigger issue, right? Which is that there's kind of an alternate philosophy, kind of against commitment, or against arenas, right? That you shouldn't let yourself, and this is where authenticity kind of hits up against sincerity in a really strong way, at least in this sense of authenticity being used based on Simone de Beauvoir, where, and Paul picks up on this, right? I mean, authenticity is very slippery in the way it's being used here, but if it's something like being, it's almost like being sincere to yourself, right? Committed to yourself as kind of above and beyond any other commitments, which is obviously a very different thing than, you know, being committed to, you know, and this is what I got into this morning, is like, you know, how do we prioritize which commitments is a big part of this, you know? Is commitment to, you know, self first? Is commitment to marriage first? Is commitment to God first? To church, right? Like, there's hierarchies, not just first, right? You have to figure out first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and that's really challenging. And there's going to be tensions there. There's going to be tensions between your sincerity or commitment or integrity to each of those arenas. And right, there's also something else sort of going on here with the way that authenticity is being used, because there's like integrity to self or sincerity to self, so committed to kind of a self-image, as if you know, in your own, I don't know, as you self-discovery project, I guess, kind of to use that terminology, maybe. But there's also this other thing, right? There's this How do I put it? There. Okay, let's go back to gender and sex as our example here. So, if we see those as separate arenas, I think that's not going to be super debatable. So they're separate arenas, but somehow they're correlated. And some people live in a tension between those arenas, and some people don't live in as much of a tension in those arenas. And by arenas, I mean their commitment or sincerity to those arenas. Some people would say, like, they would ignore, in theory, they could try to ignore it, but then, at some point it will rear back its ugly head because something in their arena that they live in will make them, whether it's a driver's license or someone relating to them or expecting them to dress a certain way or whatever it is. However, a lot of what happens in the conformity discussion, when we're talking about, let's say sex and gender conforming, or people not even there, but just within an arena, like being sincere / conforming to a, all right, so this is where it gets tricky. Hold on, let me think about it for a second. There's a difference here. Conforming to an arena, when we use things like gender conformity, we're really talking something almost at like the group statistical, like law of averages level. Like, I expect, women as a whole to be X, or men as a whole to be Y, or transgender people as a whole to be X or Y. And that is at this collective level. But when we talk about both sincerity and authenticity, they're at the personal level. It is my individual commitment to being that, to fulfilling that role in that arena, that function. Those are bad. I don't even like those words here. I think it should be my commitment to the responsibility that I'm called to or expected of in that space. Right? So you have how I individually relate to the space versus how I individually relate to the collective expectations of that space. So, right, if you are, let's say, let's pick something where it's like, non-gender conforming. So, gosh, nowadays it's actually harder and harder to do in some ways. So I'm going to just go with like a super traditional example. A male nurse. Okay. So, am I going to fulfill sincerely my responsibility as a nurse, whether I'm male or female? But here, for the male nurse, of course, right? I mean, in theory, if you're committed to your job, right, you're going to fulfill that. Now, you may not conform to people's expectations of what a nurse is at the collective level, but that's its own separate thing in some sense. And you don't, and this isn't, sorry, got a little lost there. And I think this is where kind of the whole personalist argument comes in, is, we can talk about this at that level of, what does it mean for Job to have integrity, to be, it's being either committed to God, or committed to a specific, set of morality. We can argue about which one he's actually committed to. But right, that's what makes him sincere. And I think this all fits together, but I want to keep like pushing it a little bit, because there is this opposite view, right? And I think that's important to know. And it's not just necessarily a cost-benefit view, though that's part of it, right? There's also this like larger metaphysical issue that, metaphysical view that someone can, and none of these are real commitments. These commitments are actually bad, that one should and can be much more fluid, and constantly redefining and redefining themselves. And in some way, there is a truth there, and I don't want to dismiss it, right? In the sense of, we don't want everything to be super highly conformal. We don't want a Tower of Babel situation where everything has to be exactly very rigid. You know, this is super strict hierarchical structures that don't have, you know, and this gets back to my original conversation, right? Because if you have that, then you have basically people who are excluded because they don't hold the right propositions. You don't hold a space for the fringe. They are cut off and excluded immediately because they challenge that system. So there's something important about not being overly conformal and also being open to individual variation, because obviously, to some extent, that individual variation matters. Like, there is no perfectly average person who has the perfectly average size family and the perfectly average height and the perfectly average IQ. Like, there's no one, like, prototypical thing that we can all be that's exactly center. I mean, that doesn't, right? Like, their statistics are descriptive. They're not prescriptive. And but they form our expectations. So if when we encounter people, and then we have to kind of, this is going to be very Bayesian, right? But you come in with an a priori kind of statistical assumption of where someone falls in your models, in your brain of, all different types of arenas. And then you update those and kind of narrow in on how this person does or does not conform, let's say, to the norm. Both the norm in the sense of statistical norm, but also the norm as in normativity, which often is tied to that statistical norm. It's our expectations. Anyway, I don't want to go too long, but those are just some thoughts, and I think it's worth keeping exploring, and I think there's very different answers here, right? Because I think, obviously, there's this whole, sorry, I was about to end. I will still end. I'm gonna, right? There's a very Protestant notion of being able to create, fluidly create a new church as needed when you feel like the old one isn't working, and kind of doing a cost-benefit analysis, which is similar to divorce, and which is similar to breaking up, which is similar to kind of having a, this is probably not the right word, but not a fluid gender identity in the sense of being fluid, but in the sense of because fluid is now an identity, so this gets my wording is hard here. But being able to feel like one can change these things either at will or rather more easily. And that can come from a non-essentialist position, but I don't think that's the only thing here. I've tried to avoid the language of essence in this part of the discussion, because I think it confuses the issue more, honestly. Okay, have a good one.